Good morning, Cubaneros. Well, there's few things more ironic than watching former Warsaw Pact members so eager to sell out to NATO. Nations such as Poland and Hungary, who proudly defied the Soviet Empire to achieve freedom and independence, scrambled so furiously, ass over tit, to jump on the NATO wagon, even if it meant riding in the bed and nowhere near the driver's seat. Freedom and independence did not seem to mean much compared to integration within the European Union and the dollar subsidies of the North Atlantic Treaty. So, aside from the irony, is this a bad thing? Hasn't NATO kept the peace all these years and continues to do so? I answered that to an extent in my earlier video, NATO Time to Retire. I'll say here that it did not keep the peace in regard to preventing war with the USSR. A world war with the Soviet bloc was highly unlikely after Stalin's death, and that was within the first 5 years of NATO's founding, with only its original core membership, not then including West Germany. NATO has continuously expanded as the threat of a real war with the East receded. So from that perspective, NATO's role is a charade. That doesn't mean the alliance cannot and has not served useful purposes. It kept Greece and Turkey from going at each other over Cyprus, just as, for instance, it may be stopping new members Hungary and Romania from whipping up a Yugoslav-style war against one another over Transylvania. In this sense, its peacekeeping role has served to keep peace between its members, just as the Warsaw Pact kept peace between Poland and Germany. But does the alliance really promote democracy within its members any better than the Warsaw Pact did? One doesn't need to belong to it to be a formal democracy. Sweden is about as democratic as one is going to get in Europe, and that raises the point that NATO, like the Warsaw Pact, keeps local democracy from getting too far out of hand, as it does with nationalism. We all know the story of how the brave Hungarians and Czechoslovaks stood on their national sovereignty to proclaim internal democracy and neutrality, and were invaded by the USSR and Warsaw Pact allies to put them back in place. And in Poland, the mass workers' movement Solidarity threatened a peaceful revolution until crushed by an internal military coup orchestrated with Moscow. While shedding tears for those poorest Europeans, it's conveniently forgotten how democracy was screwed in Western Europe thanks to NATO. This conclusion may seem unacceptable at first. After all, West Germany had much more leeway to run its affairs than East Germany ever did, even if both regimes were the outgrowth of post-war occupation. But a closer look at the record shows the differences between NATO and the Warsaw Pact are not as wide as advertised. Greece, under the Central Union government of George and Andreas Papandreou, tried to take a neutral stand within NATO to distance itself from the massive U.S. military presence there, which favored the king and the rightists running the Greek army. To U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, this meant that Greece was run by anti-NATO leftists who were out to sabotage America's strategic interests in the Mediterranean. So, like Poland in 1981, Greece was put under the rule of a colonel's military junta to knock its act back together, with the knowing help of its great power ally. The Greek security apparatus became notorious in Europe for its repression and torture on a banana republic model, exceeding in severity the mop-up reprisals in Poland 14 years later. The same folks who cried in outrage over Jaruzelski's regime in Poland are too often the very same persons who rationalized and abetted Colonel Georgios Papadopoulos' takeover in Athens in 1967. In neighboring Turkey, there have been 4. Count them, 4. That's right. Military coups since joining NATO in 1952. Since the Turkish army was the strongest military force in the Middle East and still retained its edge in overall quality, its antics were quietly supported as long as it kept the Black Sea from becoming a Russian Great Lake. One Red Sea was enough. Rather than defend democracy, the Turkish military provoked unrest and insurgency, justifying its repression in one round after another. When the Kurds of eastern Turkey attempted to assert their civil rights, according to the democratic process, they were met with a chauvinistic repression, leading to a vicious insurgency that rivaled anything Saddam Hussein did to his own Kurds. You can bet your bottom lira that there was no sympathetic, no-fly zone day to these oppressed people. Instead, NATO accepted the Turkish government's label of the PKK insurgency as terrorist pure and simple, funding Turkey's scorched earth death squad regime in eastern Anatolia that would have done El Salvador proud. For all the Western ink and blood spilled defying Saddam in Iraqi Kurdistan, precious few drops were ever spilled on behalf of their Kurdish cousins on the right side of the NATO line. Once again, the difference between worthy and unworthy victims. Worthy being those oppressed by our enemies, like Saddam or Jaruzelski, unworthy being those oppressed by our friends in Greece and Turkey. In Spain, NATO had no trouble aiding the regime of Francisco Franco in 1955 as a feather in its war bonnet. There was no excuse of protecting democracy here. Spain in the 1950s was a relic of pre-war fascism and a military regime very much in the banana republic mold. It's true that political democracy did finally emerge in Spain, but only after the left had been conveniently crushed by blood and iron. European post-war prosperity, tourism, and shipping its unemployed to Germany as guest workers transformed Spain, not its alliance with NATO. When Portugal had its coronation revolution of 1974 and showed the last traces of 40 years of authoritarianism, it was a movement very much in the spirit of the East European movements of 1989, of the color-coded movements of the 2000s, and of the Arab Spring this year. But in 1974 there was no jubilation in Washington or Brussels, but much fear that a resurgent left was going to take Portugal out of NATO. It had already done enough damage by turning loose Portugal's African colonies, which fell into the Soviet orbit, and it was feared Portugal itself would do the same. Here there was no external invasion or internal military coup to set things right, but a manipulation of the democratic process, one of the first examples of the greater sophistication Washington has learned in dealing with insurgent satellites. After 2 years of unsettling and sweeping reforms, a compliant socialist party used its street creds to get elected, then turned the country over to the IMF, rolling back the democratic social reforms of 1974 and integrating Portugal into the EU. We see what an economic blessing that has been for the people of Portugal. But wait, whoever said they counted for anything? So, we see in practice that Western European allies of NATO, including Greece and Turkey, have been treated like satellite regimes given internal leeway, especially when it came to crushing democracy rather than fostering it. What does this mean for its newest members to the east? Ironically, we saw former East Bloc states like Estonia or Poland, so proud of their nationalist insurgent defiance of Moscow, sending their new NATO armed forces to aid the occupation of Iraq and crush the insurgency there. If anyone ever raised the contradiction of memorializing NATO forest brothers, while their grandsons traveled thousands of miles from home to war against desert brothers under the command of an external alliance, you can bet it's kept out of the local media, and it will certainly never disturb the American or West European conscience. What took so long? Hello, like Valenza. What do you have to say for yourself? Just that now, under the rule of the free market and multi-party politics and NATO, there's no need for the workers' democracy you led in solidarity. Well, that's what the party used to tell you. In People's Poland, you had a workers' government already, in alliance with the first workers' and peasants' Soviet state. So solidarity was useless then, too. I suspect, though, it's no more or less useless now than it was back then. If you called another mass strike in neoliberal Poland, they'd come, what's that? Let them try? There'd be a series of emergency meetings immediately in Washington and Brussels, and NATO tanks would be breaking up the subversion and terrorism. And it wouldn't take a year and a half to do it. And that'd be okay with you.